They were more accurate than anything the West had ever produced, more detailed, more precise, more obsessively, almost pathologically complete, street by street, building by building, elevation by elevation. The maps showed sewage systems and electrical grids and the load-bearing capacity of bridges, and the width of roads at their narrowest points and the depth of rivers at their shallowest crossings. They showed which buildings had basements large enough to store military equipment. They showed the location of fuel depots and communication relay stations and water treatment facilities and rail switching yards. Infrastructure that most civilians never think about and that every military planner thinks about constantly. They showed American cities, British cities, West German cities, French cities, cities across NATO territory, cities whose own municipal governments did not possess maps of equivalent detail, cities whose own military planners, working with the best cartographic resources the Western Alliance could produce, were working with less complete information about their own territory than the Soviet military had compiled from the other side of the Iron Curtain. When Western intelligence analysts first began to understand what they were looking at, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, as the Soviet Union collapsed and its secrets began to surface, the reaction was not anger. It was all pure, undiluted, professionally humbling awe, because what the Soviets had built, quietly, methodically, over decades, using techniques and resources and institutional commitment that had no equivalent in the Western world, was not just a collection of maps. It was the most ambitious cartographic project in human history, a systematic effort to render the entire surface of the Earth in sufficient detail to fight and win a global war. And almost no one in the West had known it existed. To understand how this happened and why it matters, you have to go back to the beginning, not to the Cold War, but further, back to the particular way that Russia, across centuries of its history, had learned to think about maps. Geography shaped Russia in ways that shaped everything else about it. The Russian landmass, the largest continuous territory on Earth, is almost entirely without natural defensive barriers. No mountain ranges protecting the western approaches, no ocean channel providing strategic depth, no deserts or jungles or swamps offering the kind of terrain obstacles that have historically allowed smaller nations to defend themselves against larger ones. Just flat, open, enormous steppe, stretching from the Polish border to the Urals, from the Urals to Pacific, a vast and theoretically traversable plain that has historically been as much a liability as an asset. Russia had been invaded across that plain, repeatedly, by the Mongols in the 13th century, an invasion so catastrophic that its demographic and psychological effects shaped Russian civilization for generations, by Napoleon in 1812. An invasion that reached Moscow itself before the combination of Russian winter and Russian scorched earth tactics ground the Grande Armée into destruction, by the Germans in 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history, which drove 300 miles into Soviet territory in the first weeks alone and ultimately cost the Soviet Union somewhere between 27 and 30 million lives. Every one of those invasions had taught the same lesson. Geography matters. Terrain matters. The difference between knowing the land you're fighting on and not knowing it, knowing where the roads turn to mud in autumn, where the river crossings are passable in spring, where the high ground commands the approaches to the city, is the difference between victory and catastrophe. The Soviet military had absorbed that lesson at the cellular level. It was written into its doctrine, its planning assumptions, its institutional priorities. And when the Cold War began and the Soviet military began to think seriously about what a war against NATO would look like, what the operational requirements of a westward offensive through Germany and France and into the Atlantic ports would demand, the conclusion was inescapable. They needed maps, not the maps that existed. Better maps, more complete maps, maps that reflected the actual state of the terrain, not as it had been surveyed 20 or 30 years ago, but as it was now. Maps that included every piece of infrastructure that a modern mechanized army would need to use, destroy, capture, or avoid. Maps that gave Soviet commanders the same intimate knowledge of Western European terrain that those commanders would have had of their own territory. They needed, in short, to know the West better than the West knew itself. And so they set out to do exactly that. The organization that took on this task was called the General Staff's Military Topographic Directorate. It was not a glamorous institution. It did not run spies or develop weapons or plan operations. It made maps. That was its entire purpose, its entire identity, its entire reason for existing. And it pursued that purpose with a dedication and a systematic rigor that, in retrospect, deserves to be recognized as one of the most remarkable institutional achievements of the Cold War era, even if it was an achievement in service of goals that the free world had every reason to fear. The Directorate had been established in its modern form after the Second World War, though its roots went back much further, to the cartographic traditions of the Imperial Russian military. The war had demonstrated, with brutal clarity, the operational consequences of inadequate mapping. The Wehrmacht's maps of Soviet territory had been, in places, dangerously incomplete, a fact that contributed to some of the logistical failures that slowed the German advance at critical moments. The Red Army's own maps have been better in some areas, worse in others, and the experience of fighting across 2,000 miles of varied terrain had produced a generation of Soviet military officers with a visceral understanding of why precise cartographic knowledge was not a luxury but a necessity. The Directorate took that understanding and built an institution around it. At its peak, through the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, the Military Topographic Directorate employed thousands of cartographers, surveyors, analysts, and support personnel. It operated with a budget that was classified, but that Western analysts, once they began to piece together the scale of the operation, estimated as staggeringly large by any reasonable comparison with equivalent Western institutions. It had access to satellite imagery. The Soviet space program produced reconnaissance satellites specifically tasked with cartographic collection, and an aerial photography program's extraordinary scope and ambition. And it had something else, something that no satellite and no aerial camera could fully replicate. It had people on the ground. The human intelligence component of the Soviet mapping program is, in many ways, the most extraordinary part of the story, because satellites can photograph a city from above. They can capture road networks and building footprints and the general layout of urban terrain with remarkable precision. What they cannot easily capture, what requires human presence, human observation, human judgment, is a ground-level detail that distinguishes a map useful for navigation from a map useful for military operations. The height of a curb, the clearance under a railway bridge, the gradient of a road approaching an intersection, the actual, not theoretical, width of a street between parked vehicles, the location of underground infrastructure, pipes, cables, tunnels. That appears nowhere on civilian maps, but matters enormously when you're thinking about where to route communications, where preposition supplies, where an enemy might hide equipment, or where your own forces might find cover. The Soviets collected this information through a network of collection efforts so comprehensive that it amounted to a systematic survey of the entire Western world, conducted over decades without the West fully realizing it was happening. Soviet diplomatic personnel, embassy staff, trade mission members, cultural attaches, were routinely tasked with cartographic collection during their postings in Western countries. Not all of them, not obviously, but enough and systematically enough that their observations fed into a centralized collection system that aggregated individual fragments of ground truth information into maps of steadily increasing precision and completeness. Soviet merchant sailors, the crews of the vessels that moved through Western ports in the normal course of international trade, contributed observations of port facilities, harbor depths, dock capacities, and coastal infrastructure that supplemented aerial and satellite collection with the irreplaceable perspective of someone who had actually stood on the ground and looked. Soviet scientists attending international conferences, Soviet athletes competing in Western cities, Soviet journalists covering events abroad, the tourist trade limited but not non-existent between the Soviet bloc and the West. Every human contact with Western territory was, in principle, an opportunity for cartographic collection, and the Director had developed the institutional infrastructure to exploit those opportunities systematically. It was patient work, unglamorous work, work that produced results not in the dramatic, immediate fashion of a successful intelligence coup, but in the slow accumulation of detail upon detail upon detail, each observation individually trivial, collectively constituting something of extraordinary strategic value. The maps they produced reflected all of it. Western intelligence agencies were not entirely blind to what was happening. CIA analysts have been aware, since at least the 1960s, that the Soviets were engaged in large-scale cartographic activity targeting Western territory. Signals intelligence, intercepted communications, occasionally provided glimpses of the program's scope. Defectors from the Soviet military and intelligence services sometimes brought fragments of information about the mapping effort and the occasional recovery of Soviet maps. Through intelligence operations, through the examination of equipment captured or recovered in various Cold War contexts, provided direct evidence of the program's output. But the full picture remained elusive because the directorate was careful. It classified its products at the highest levels. The maps it produced were not distributed widely. They went to specific military units, specific planning staffs, specific operational commands on a strict need-to-know basis. A Soviet tank regiment commander preparing for a hypothetical westward offensive through Germany might have access to extraordinarily detailed maps of the specific terrain his unit will be crossing, maps far more detailed than anything NATO possessed in the same area, without any individual in the Western intelligence community being able to connect the dots into a coherent picture of the program as a whole. It was, in a sense, hidden in plain sight. The Soviets were clearly making maps. Maps were a normal military activity. Every military made maps. The possibility that the Soviet mapping program was operating at a scale and with a level of detail that had no Western equivalent, that what looked like a routine military function was actually something categorically different, was a conclusion that required assembling evidence that was, by design, scattered and incomplete, and so the West underestimated it. For decades, until the wall came down and the archives began to open and analysts who had spent careers studying the Soviet military machine started to encounter, for the first time, the actual product of the directorate's work, and understood with a clarity that was equal parts admiration and alarm exactly what they had been up against. If the hidden dimensions of Cold War intelligence, the secret programs, the systematic deceptions, the extraordinary institutional efforts that shape the balance of power without ever appearing in the headlines, are the stories that keep you coming back, consider subscribing to Cold War Discoveries. This is exactly the kind of history we exist to tell. The first time a Western cartographer held one in his hands, really held one, really looked at it, he didn't say anything for a long time. He just turned the pages. This was in the early 1990s. The Soviet Union was collapsing. The archives were opening. Not all of them, not quickly, not without resistance from the institutional inertia of a security state that had spent 7 decades treating secrecy as a reflex, but opening. And among the things that were surfacing, in military surplus markets, in the hands of former Soviet officers who suddenly needed hard currency, and the chaotic redistribution of state assets that accompanied the USSR's disintegration, were the maps, rolled and folded and stacked in warehouses, packed in military-issue cases, stored in the map rooms of army units that no longer existed, in the planning offices of commands that had been dissolved, in the archives of an institution whose reason for existing had, seemingly overnight, evaporated. They were extraordinary. The cartographer, a British academic who had spent his career studying military mapping and who would later write some of the most important scholarship on the Soviet program, described his first encounter with the maps in terms that were almost reverential. The detail was unlike anything he had seen. The precision was unlike anything he had seen. The sheer scope of the effort implied by what he was holding, the institutional commitment, the resource investment, the decades of patient systematic work that had produced this, was unlike anything he had seen. He was looking at maps of English cities, his cities, places he had lived and worked and walked through his entire life. And the maps knew things about those places that he hadn't known, that the municipal authorities hadn't known, that the British military, working from its own cartographic resources, had not captured with this level of completeness. He turned the pages and said nothing for a long time. What made the Soviet maps so extraordinary was not any single feature. It was a combination, the way in which multiple layers of information, each individually valuable, had been assembled into a unified product of almost overwhelming comprehensiveness. Start with the basics. The Soviet maps were produced at multiple scales, from broad regional overviews down to city plans of extraordinary granularity. The city plans, produced at scales of 1 to 10,000 or even 1 to 5,000, meaning that 1 centimeter on the map represented 50 or 100 meters on the ground, captured individual buildings as distinct objects with their own footprints, their own heights, their own designated functions, not just major buildings, not just government offices and military installations, and the obvious landmarks that appear on any tourist map. Every building, residential blocks, industrial facilities, hospitals, marked with their capacity and beds, a detail of obvious relevance to military planners thinking about casualty management in a theater of operations, churches, marked with their tower heights, relevant for artillery spotters and aviators establishing reference points, hotels, marked with their room counts and, in some cases, their basement configurations relevant for the building of troops in an occupied city. The road network was captured at a level of detail that went far beyond what civilian maps provided. Not just the existence of roads, but their specifications, surface type, width, load-bearing capacity, gradient on significant slopes, the clearance heights of bridges and underpasses, the turning radii at key intersections, information that a civilian driver never needs and that a military logistics planner needs desperately. Because the difference between a road that can support a main battle tank and one that cannot is the difference between an operational axis and a dead end. Railways were mapped with equivalent thoroughness, station layouts, switching yard configurations. The gauge of the track, critical, because Soviet and Western European rail gauges differ, a logistical complication that any westward Soviet offensive would have had to manage. Tunnel dimensions, bridge load ratings, depot locations and their estimated storage capacities, waterways. Rivers were mapped with depth soundings at regular intervals, not the average depth, not the theoretical depth, but the actual measured depth at the time of survey, updated periodically as conditions changed. 4 locations, places where vehicles could cross without bridges, were marked explicitly with notations about the substrate and the approaches. The load-bearing capacity of river ice in winter was noted where relevant. The seasonal variation in water levels was documented. And then there was the underground. The subsurface mapping was, in some ways, the most remarkable component of the entire program, because the surface of a city is what you can photograph from the air. It is what satellites can capture, and aerial reconnaissance can document, and casual human observation can record. The underground is different. The underground requires different collection methods, different sources, different analytical techniques. And the underground, in a modern industrial city, is where a surprising amount of the infrastructure that keeps the city functioning actually lives. Water mains, sewer systems, electrical conduits, telecommunications cables, the physical infrastructure of the telephone network, in an era before the internet, represented the city's nervous system, and cutting it in the right places could render a military command structure deaf and blind far more effectively than bombing the buildings above. Steam heating pipes, present in many European cities as district heating systems, running beneath the streets in tunnels large enough, in some cases, for a person to move through. Underground railway systems, not just their public-facing stations and lines, but their maintenance tunnels, their emergency access points, their ventilation systems, their potential utility as shelter or as covered movement corridors. The Soviets mapped all of it, not perfectly, not everywhere. The quality and completeness of the subsurface mapping varied by city and by era. Earlier maps were less complete than later ones, as collection improved and analytical techniques developed, but the ambition was total. The institutional commitment was to render the underground as legible as a surface, to give Soviet military planners the ability to think about a Western city not just as a collection of buildings and streets, but as a three-dimensional operational environment, understood from the foundations up. When Western analysts began to examine this material in detail, comparing Soviet maps of specific cities against the best mapping that Western military and civilian authorities possess of those same cities, the results were consistently humbling. In city after city, the Soviet maps contained accurate information about subsurface infrastructure that was not present in any Western cartographic source. Information that, in some cases, local utility companies struggled to verify because their own records were incomplete or out of date. The Soviets, in some instances, knew Western cities better than the cities knew themselves. The question that Western analysts found themselves asking, once the initial awe had subsided enough to permit analytical thinking, was an obvious one. How? How had an organization operating from behind the Iron Curtain, with limited direct access to Western territory, without the ability to conduct the kind of open survey work that Western cartographic agencies took for granted, produce maps of this quality and completeness? The answer, when it was pieced together from multiple sources, defector testimony, recovered documents, the maps themselves and what they implied about collection methodology, was both simpler and more complex than most analysts had initially assumed. Part of the answer was technology. The Soviet space program, often discussed primarily in terms of its military and propaganda dimensions, had a cartographic component that was, in terms of its contribution to Soviet military capability, arguably its most practically significant achievement. The reconnaissance satellites that the Soviet military operated from the early 1960s onward produced photographic coverage of Western territory at resolutions that improved steadily with each generation of technology. By the 1970s and 1980s, Soviet satellite imagery of Western cities was detailed enough to support the kind of building-by-building mapping that the Directorate's products displayed. But satellite imagery has limits. It captures what is visible from above. It cannot easily capture the height of a curb or the clearance under a bridge or the load rating of a road surface. It cannot capture anything underground, and it requires interpretation, the translation of photographic data into cartographic information that demands human expertise and judgment and, critically, ground truth verification. That verification came from human sources. The scale of the human collection effort, the systematic tasking of Soviet personnel with legitimate reasons to be in Western countries, was larger than Western intelligence had fully appreciated, and it was supplemented by something even more difficult to detect and counter: unwitting sources. The genius, if that word could be applied to something in service of such troubling ends, of the Soviet cartographic collection program, was its ability to extract useful information from sources that had no idea they were providing it. Published materials were one major avenue. Western cities, unlike Soviet ones, produce an extraordinary volume of publicly available information about their own infrastructure, municipal planning documents, engineering reports, academic studies of urban systems, trade publications for the construction and utilities industries, local newspaper coverage of infrastructure projects, freedom of information requests, a concept that had no Soviet equivalent but that Western governments honored, producing detailed responses about infrastructure that Soviet analysts could aggregate into cartographic products. The Soviets read all of it, systematically, institutionally, with the dedicated attention of an organization that had decided this information was strategically valuable and had allocated the resources to exploit it. Commercial maps were another source. The detailed street atlases produced by Western publishing companies, sold in bookshops and petrol stations across Europe and America, contain more information than most of their buyers ever fully processed. Road widths, bridge locations, tunnel entrances, industrial zones, railway infrastructure. The Soviets bought them, all of them, every edition, and compared each new edition against previous ones to track changes in infrastructure, new roads, demolished buildings, expanded facilities, with an attentiveness that the publishers themselves probably never imagined their products warranted. Aerial photographs, published in books and magazines, and the promotional materials of cities promoting tourism and investment, were analyzed for the ground-level detail visible at the edges of the frame, in the shadows between buildings, in the reflections off what streets that revealed surface textures invisible in direct overhead photography. And then there were the technical standards. Western engineering and construction followed published standards, codes that specified, in precise numerical terms, the dimensions and load capacities of infrastructure built to those standards. A bridge built to British highway engineering standards of a particular era had, within knowable ranges, a predictable load rating. A road surface of specified type and age had a predictable bearing capacity. By mapping the standards and correlating them with visible infrastructure, Soviet analysts could infer specifications that had never been directly measured. It was, in its totality, an intelligence operation of extraordinary sophistication, not dramatic, not cinematic in conventional sense. No dead drops in rainy parks, no agents crossing borders with microfilm, no confrontations in the shadow of the Berlin Wall, just patient, systematic, institutionally disciplined exploitation of every available source of information about a world that the Soviet military intended, if the worst came to the worst, to fight its way through. By the mid-1980s, at the peak of the program's output, the military topographic director had produced maps covering virtually the entire land surface of the Earth at militarily useful scales. The coverage of NATO territory was the most complete and the most detailed. Western Europe had been mapped at the 1 to 50,000 scale, the standard military topographic scale, detailed enough to support tactical planning at the battalion and regimental level, with updates at regular intervals to capture infrastructure changes. Major cities have been mapped at much larger scales. The 1 to 10,000 city plans covered hundreds of urban areas across Western Europe and North America. The United States had not been neglected. American cities, New York, Washington, Chicago, Los Angeles, and dozens of others had been mapped at the same level of detail as European ones. The American road network, the American rail system, the American port infrastructure, the American military installations, bases, depots, airfields, naval stations, mapped with particular care and attention, cross-referenced against other intelligence sources to produce assessments of capacity and function that went beyond what cartographic data alone could provide. The scale of this effort, the resources required to produce, update, store, and distribute millions of map sheets covering the entire world was staggering. The printing infrastructure alone represented a major industrial investment. The storage facilities required to maintain the physical map archive before digitization. These were paper maps. Enormous quantities of paper maps occupied warehouses across the Soviet Union. The distribution system that got the right maps to the right units at the right time was a logistical operation of considerable complexity. All of it hidden, all of it classified, all of it invisible to the Western public, and only partially visible to Western intelligence, until the wall came down and the maps began to surface. The wall came down on a Thursday night. By Friday morning, before the television crews had finished their live broadcasts, before the politicians had composed their statements, before the historians had begun to process what they were witnessing, the looting had started. Not the violent, chaotic looting of a city under siege. Something quieter, more methodical, the systematic redistribution of the assets of a state that was losing its grip on everything it had spent 7 decades accumulating, including its secrets. Soviet military warehouses were not immune. In the months and years that followed the fall of the Berlin Wall, as the Warsaw Pact dissolved, as the Soviet republics declared independence one by one, as the institutions of the Soviet military establishment scrambled to adapt to a reality none of them had planned for, the physical infrastructure of the Soviet military mapping program began to disperse. Some of it was destroyed. Orders went out in confused, contradictory, partially obeyed fashion of bureaucracy in the process of collapse, to destroy sensitive materials before they could fall into Western hands. Classified map collections were shredded or burned in some facilities. The most sensitive product of the Directorate, the detailed city plans of NATO capitals, the assessment of American military infrastructure, the materials that most directly revealed Soviet operational planning, were prioritized for destruction. But the program was too large. The archive was too vast. The institutional will to carry out the destruction orders was, in many facilities, simply insufficient. Overwhelmed by the chaos of the moment, undermined by the venality of individuals who understood that what they were sitting on had monetary value, defeated by the sheer physical impossibility of destroying millions of map sheets before the new authorities arrived to ask uncomfortable questions about what was being burned and why. The maps got out. They surfaced first in the military surplus markets of Eastern Europe, Budapest, Warsaw, Prague, the street markets and flea markets and informal trading networks that sprang up across the former Soviet bloc in the early 1990s, where everything from military uniforms to optical equipment to communications gear was available for remarkably modest sums, began to include among their offerings the maps. Former Soviet officers sold them. Warehouse workers sold them. People who had stumbled across caches of materials during the general redistribution of Soviet state property sold them. The prices were low, astonishingly low, given what the materials represented, because the sellers understood them primarily as curiosities, as collectibles, as the kind of Cold War ephemera that Western tourists found interesting and were willing to pay a few dollars or Deutschmarks to acquire. The Western academics and cartographers and intelligence professionals who began to seek them out systematically understood something else entirely. John Davies was one of them, a British cartographer and geographer who had spent years studying military mapping. Davies began acquiring Soviet maps in the early 1990s and quickly realized that what he was accumulating was not merely a collection of interesting historical artifacts. It was evidence of a program whose scale and sophistication had no Western equivalent. A systematic effort to render the entire surface of the Earth in military useful detail that represented, in his assessment, the greatest cartographic achievement of the 20th century. That assessment, coming from a man whose professional life had been devoted to the study of maps, who had examined the cartographic output of every major military power in history, was not made lightly. He meant it, and as more of the material surfaced, as collectors and academics and former intelligence professionals began to pool their findings, compare their acquisitions, piece together the full picture of what the directorate had produced, the assessment only strengthened. The reaction in Western intelligence communities was complex. There was inevitably embarrassment. The CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the British intelligence services, organizations that had spent decades trying to understand Soviet military capability, had known that the mapping program existed. They had not known its full extent. They had not appreciated the level of detail that Soviet city plans achieved. They had not fully grasped the scope of the subsurface mapping effort, and they had not understood, until they saw the product directly, how systematically the Soviets had exploited open-source Western materials to supplement their technical collection. The embarrassment was professional and institutional. It was the embarrassment of experts who discovered that the thing they thought they understood, they had only partially understood, that the adversary they had spent careers analyzing had been operating in this particular domain at a level of sophistication that had not been fully appreciated. But alongside the embarrassment, and in some ways more significant, was the analytical opportunity. Because the maps were not just evidence of what the Soviets had collected, they were evidence of what the Soviets had planned. The specific areas mapped at the highest levels of detail, the specific infrastructure elements singled out for the most thorough documentation, the specific cities that had received the most recent updates, the specific military installations that had been mapped with the greatest precision and the most current information. All of these choices made by Soviet military planners about where to invest their most intensive collection effort, reflected assessments about where the fighting, if it came, was most likely to occur, about which terrain was most operationally significant, about which infrastructure was most critical to control or destroy. The maps, in other words, were a window into Soviet operational planning, a window that Western analysts, examining the material with the benefit of hindsight and the freedom to look at it openly rather than trying to reconstruct it from fragments, found extraordinarily illuminating. What the maps revealed about Soviet operational intentions was sobering, though perhaps not surprising to those who had spent careers studying Soviet military doctrine. The coverage of West Germany was the most intensive of any NATO territory. The North German plain, the broad, flat corridor running from the Polish border westward through Hamburg toward the Rhine and the Low Countries, had been mapped at scales and with levels of detail that implied it was considered the primary axis of advance for a westward Soviet offensive. The road network of this corridor had been mapped with meticulous attention to load-bearing capacity, the specific information needed to route heavy armored formations. The Rhine crossings had been documented with particular thoroughness, bridge capacities, alternative crossing points for locations, the engineering requirements for constructing military pontoon bridges. The implication was clear. Soviet planners had been thinking seriously and in detail about how to get across the Rhine, not as an abstract strategic concept, as a practical operational problem, one they had invested significant resources in solving cartographically long before any shooting started. The port cities of Western Europe, Rotterdam, Hamburg, Antwerp, Brest, had received similarly intensive attention. These were the points through which American reinforcements and supplies would flow in the event of a European war. Controlling them, or denying their use to NATO, would be a critical early objective for any Soviet campaign, to prevent the United States from bringing its full economic and military weight to bear on a European theater. The Soviet maps of these cities were, in some cases, more detailed than the Port Authority's own operational charts. And the maps of American military installations in Europe, the bases, the depots, the airfields, the nuclear weapons storage sites, were detailed in ways that made their purpose unmistakable. These were targeting documents as much as cartographic ones. Precise, current, annotated with information about capacity and function, and, in some cases, with assessment of vulnerability that reflected a level of analytical sophistication that went beyond simple mapping into genuine intelligence production. The Soviets had not merely mapped the West. They had mapped it for war. This was the context in which American military planners, examining the Soviet maps in the early 1990s, had to assess what they meant for NATO's Cold War posture. The honest answer, and American military professionals are, whatever their other qualities, generally capable of honesty in their internal assessments, was that the maps represented a genuine asymmetry, not a decisive one, not one that by itself would determine the outcome of a European war, but a real one, a domain in which the Soviet military had invested more heavily and achieved more impressive results than its NATO counterparts. NATO had good maps of its own territory. The U.S. Army Map Service, the British Directorate of Military Survey, the cartographic agencies of the West German Bundeswehr. These were serious professional organizations that produced high-quality military mapping. The topographic maps that NATO forces relied on for operational planning were accurate and useful, but they were not at the city plan scale, at the level of infrastructure detail, at the depth of subsurface documentation. Equivalent to what the Soviets had produced, the gap was real, and it had operational implications. A Soviet armored column advancing through West Germany would have been operating with cartographic support that gave its commanders a more complete picture of the terrain than their NATO counterparts possessed of the same ground. Not in every respect. NATO's familiarity with its own territory, its relationships with local civilian authorities, its ability to update its information in real time as operations developed, all partially compensated for the cartographic deficit. But in the specific domain of pre-planned infrastructure knowledge, knowing in advance which bridges could bear which loads, which roads would support which vehicles, which crossings were available and which were not, the Soviet advantage was real. It was a sobering realization, and it prompted a significant American and NATO investment in cartographic modernization in the post-Cold War period. An investment that eventually produced the digital mapping systems that American military forces have used in every conflict since. The Soviet maps, in a very real sense, improved Western cartography by showing the West what it didn't know about itself. But the story of the Soviet maps extends beyond their military implications into territory that is, in its own way, even more remarkable because the map survived the Cold War, and in surviving it, in the chaotic dispersal that followed the Soviet collapse, they found their way into hands that had never been part of any military or intelligence calculation. Geographers, urban historians, environmental scientists, infrastructure planners, archaeologists, all of them discovered in the 1990s and 2000s that the Soviet military had inadvertently produced something of extraordinary scientific and historical value. A systematic, consistently formatted, regularly updated survey of the entire Earth's surface, including vast areas that Western cartographic agencies had never mapped at equivalent scales, including historical snapshots of urban environments at specific moments in time that no other cartographic source had captured with comparable completeness. The maps of cities in the developing world were, in many cases, more detailed than anything produced by those cities' own governments. Areas of Africa, Asia, and Latin America that Western cartographers had mapped only at small scales, or not at all at military useful scales, have been surveyed by the Soviet Directorate with the same systematic thoroughness applied to NATO territory. Because the Cold War was a global competition, and Soviet military planning was not limited to the European theater. It encompassed every potential area of operations, every region where superpower competition might, in some scenario, produce a military confrontation. Environmental researchers discovered that the Soviet maps provided historical baseline data of extraordinary value. A map of a coastal wetland surveyed in 1975 accurate to the standards of Soviet military cartography, provided a precise record of the wetland's extent at that moment in time. Compared against current satellite imagery, it allowed researchers to quantify changes in the wetland's area and character with precision that no other historical source could have provided. Archaeologists in the Middle East and Central Asia found that Soviet maps of those regions, produced during the Cold War for operational planning purposes, had inadvertently documented archaeological sites that had since been destroyed by development or conflict. The maps showed the locations and extensive features that no longer exist on the ground, preserving, in cartographic form, a record of human history that had otherwise been lost. Urban historians discovered that the Soviet city plans provided snapshots of urban environments at specific historical moments, the late 1970s, the early 1980s, that allowed them to reconstruct the built environment of those periods with precision that contemporary Western sources could not match. Buildings that had since been demolished, streets that had been rerouted, industrial facilities that had been cleared, all preserved in Soviet military mapping at a scale and with a level of detail that made serious historical analysis possible. The instrument of Cold War military planning had become, in its afterlife, a scientific resource of unexpected richness. There is something almost paradoxical about this outcome, something that resists easy moral categorization. The Soviet mapping program was built for war. Its purpose was to give a Red Army the cartographic foundation it needed to fight its way across Western Europe, to defeat NATO, to reach the Atlantic, to impose Soviet power on nations that had spent the Cold War doing everything in their power to prevent exactly that outcome. It was, in its intent, one of the most sustained and systematic preparations for military aggression in modern history. And yet, the maps it produced, the extraordinary, obsessively detailed, astonishingly comprehensive maps that the Military Topographic Directorate spent decades creating, have outlasted the military purpose they were built to serve. They have found uses their creators never imagined. They have contributed to scientific knowledge, to historical understanding, to environmental research, to the documentation of human heritage. They have improved Western cartography by demonstrating what was possible when an institution committed itself, with sufficient resources and sufficient patience, to the systematic rendering of the world. They are, in the full complexity of what they represent, instruments of a system that imprisoned half of Europe for 45 years, evidence of military ambition that the free world spent 4 decades, an incalculable treasure preventing from being realized, and simultaneously one of the great cartographic achievements of the 20th century, a fitting artifact of the Cold War itself, an era defined by paradox, by the coexistence of extraordinary human achievement and extraordinary human threat, by the fact that the same competition that produced the Gulag and the nuclear arsenal also produced the internet and the space program, and it turns out the most complete maps of the Earth that had ever been made. Here is what the maps tell us, in the end, about the Cold War itself. Not about Soviet military planning, not about cartographic methodology, not about the operational implications of asymmetric information in a European theater of war. Something simpler, something more fundamental. They tell us that the Cold War was serious, deadly, institutionally committed, decades-long serious. That the adversary of the United States and its allies faced was not a blundering, inefficient, casually threatening rival that could be managed with minimal effort and occasional diplomacy. It was a system that had decided, at the highest levels, with full institutional weight behind the decision, that it needed to know the West well enough to destroy it, and had spent 40 years quietly, methodically, invisibly building the knowledge base required to do exactly that. The maps are the physical evidence of that commitment. Millions of sheets of paper, thousands of cartographers, decades of patient collection, all of it in service of a war that, thankfully, at incalculable cost in treasure and vigilance and sustained national will, never came. It never came because the United States chose to take the threat seriously, because American military planners, American intelligence professionals, American scientists and engineers and diplomats and soldiers maintained, across 4.5 decades, through administrations of both parties, through periods of public exhaustion and political division, and genuine uncertainty about whether the effort was worth sustaining, a level of commitment and capability that made the Soviet military calculus unworkable. The maps existed because the Soviets were planning for a war they believed they might need to fight. The war never happened because America made the cost of fighting it too high. The last of the Soviet map archives were formally transferred or destroyed in the mid-1990s. Some collections remain classified, held by the successor states of the former Soviet Union. Their content still not fully known to Western researchers. Some are in private hands. Collectors and academics who acquired them in the chaotic aftermath of the Soviet collapse and have spent decades cataloging and studying what they found. Some are in university libraries, available to anyone who wants to look. Extraordinary documents, dense with the detail of a world that no longer exists in the form they captured, produced by an institution that no longer exists, for a military that no longer exists, in service of a state that no longer exists. You can hold one in your hands. You can open it to a map of the city you know, London or Paris or Washington, and trace the streets with your finger and read the annotations and understand viscerally and directly in a way that no history book quite replicates what the Cold War actually was. Not an abstraction, not a geopolitical framework, not a chapter in a textbook, a real competition between real institutions with real stakes, conducted with real seriousness by people who understood that the outcome mattered and who were prepared to invest whatever it took to win. America won, and the maps, those extraordinary, unsettling, paradoxically beautiful maps, are what loser would look like from the other side if this story gave you a new way of seeing the Cold War. Subscribe to Cold War Discoveries and hit the like button. Every video we make is built on the same commitment that built those maps. Patient, thorough, serious about getting it right. We'll see you in the next one.